stand right here with me at the end of your own driveway and look back at that row of lavender along the front walk. From this exact spot where a buyer parks and where an appraiser first lifts his eyes, that plant is already talking. That silver line is either whispering that a careful person lives here, or it's quietly confessing that something in this yard gave up a while ago. I've spent decades quoting front yards and standing right beside buyers as their eyes swept a property, and lavender is one of the very first things the eye grabs. Once I watched a couple sit in their car a full minute while the wife pointed at a leggy, split-open lavender by the porch and said, "If they let that go, what else can't we see?" They never got out. Stay with me to the last stop, because there is one small thing about the base of the plant that decides whether your lavender reads like a $200 designer border or a dead shrub nobody bothered to water, and it costs almost nothing to fix. Whether you plan to stay for years or list in the spring, this is exactly what your curb is saying about you right now. So let's walk it together, slow, the way a stranger does. The first thing I want you to do is crouch down and look at the ground your lavender is actually growing in. Not the plant, the dirt, because this is where most of you already lost the game before the first leaf ever opened. Push a finger into the soil right up against the stem. If it comes back cool and damp, if it clings, if it smells rich and earthy like a garden bed, your lavender is dying and it just hasn't finished the paperwork yet. Here's what almost nobody tells you at the register. Lavender is not a garden plant. It's a survivor from the dry, rocky hillsides of the Mediterranean, from ground so poor and so fast draining that most things starve there. That's the whole secret of the plant. It evolved to thrive in lean, gritty, gravelly soil where water races straight through and never lingers around the roots. So when you dig a nice generous hole, backfill it with bag garden soil and rich compost, and pat it down soft and fluffy, you think you're being kind. You're actually digging a bathtub. Every rain, every sprinkler cycle, that fluffy, rich pocket holds water like a sponge, and the roots sit in it, and they rot from the bottom up. The number that should stop you cold is this. Extension horticulturists who study lavender at university programs out west in places like Utah and Washington, where they grow acres of it commercially, will tell you that the single largest cause of lavender death is not cold, and it is not neglect. It's root rot from soil that holds too much water. More than half the lavender that fails in home yards fails right here in the dirt from a fungus that thrives in wet ground. And you can't see it happening. From above, the plant looks fine for a season. Then one hot week it goes gray-brown all at once and you think it dried out, so you water it more and you finish the job yourself. What a buyer sees from the curb isn't the fungus. They see a plant that's thin, patchy, half green and half dead, sitting in a bed that clearly gets babied and still can't keep a Mediterranean weed alive. That reads as bad luck at best and a black thumb at worst, and it drags the whole front bed down with it. The fix is almost insultingly cheap. When you plant lavender, you don't feed the hole, you starve it. Cut your native soil with coarse sand and fine gravel, mound it up a few inches so the crown sits high and proud above the surrounding grade, and let the water run away from the plant instead of pooling toward it. A bag of coarse sand and a bag of gravel runs you maybe $15, and that $15 is the difference between a plant that limps and a plant that mounds up thick and silver and expensive looking. If you want to go deeper than one afternoon on the front walk, I put everything I know about reading a property from the curb into a guide called First Look. It's part of a 3-part series: First Look, Yard Elevated, and the Yard System. And together they walk you through every detail a buyer or appraiser clocks before they ever reach your front door, in the same sequence I use when I'm standing beside a client. The whole set is $97, and you'll find the link in the description. Homeowners who go through it tell me they can't drive down their own street the same way anymore, which is exactly the point. Now, let's keep walking, because drainage is only half the story of what's drowning your lavender. Walk with me to the spigot. Look at where your sprinkler heads throw and be honest about how often that zone runs. Here's the trap almost every homeowner falls into, and I fell into it myself years ago on my own front bed. We treat lavender like every other pretty flowering plant. We see it looking a little dull in July heat, and our instinct is to reach for water, because water is love. Water is what a caring gardener does. With lavender, water is how you kill the thing you're trying to save. A mature, established lavender plant wants deep watering, maybe once every 2 weeks. And in many climates, the rain handles even that. The first season, while it roots in, you water a little more to get it going, and then you back off hard. But your automatic sprinkler system doesn't know that. It's set for your lawn, which drinks every 2 or 3 days, and your lavender is sitting right there in the splash zone taking a bath it never asked for. I've walked up to front beds where the grass was gorgeous and the lavender was black in the middle, and the owners swore they barely watered it, and they were telling the truth. They didn't. The sprinkler did. There's a second thing the water does that hits the verdict directly. All that fragrance, all that intense purple-gray color, all the essential oil that makes lavender smell like lavender is actually the plant's response to a little bit of stress and lean, dry conditions. Growers have known this for a long time. Pamper the plant with water and rich feeding, and you get soft, floppy, pale green growth with weak color and hardly any scent. Starve it a little, and you get that tight, silvery, aromatic mound that people slow down to look at. So the overwatered lavender doesn't just risk rot. It looks washed out and floppy even when it lives, and a buyer's eye reads floppy and pale as tired and cheap without ever knowing why. The change here costs you nothing but a small correction. Pull your lavender out of the lawn irrigation zone, or cap the head that hits it, or plant it somewhere the sprinklers don't reach. Water it deeply and rarely by hand its first summer, then mostly leave it alone. Free. And that free adjustment turns a floppy, pale plant into a firm silver cushion, which is exactly the texture that makes a front walk look designed instead of decorated. Now stand up and step back, therefore, because we've fixed the ground and the water, and the next mistake was made months before you ever planted. Standing in an aisle under fluorescent lights, look closely at your lavender and ask yourself a question you probably never asked. Do you actually know which lavender you bought? Because there isn't one lavender. There are dozens of types, and they are not interchangeable, and the tag at the store almost never tells you what you need to know. This is where the store quietly sets you up to fail, and I want you to see how it happens. Big box garden centers order plants by the truckload for a whole region, and they'll happily sell you a tender Spanish or French lavender in a climate where winter is going to turn it to mush, because it looks gorgeous and full on the shelf in April, and by the time it dies in January, you've long since lost the receipt, and you blame yourself. Here is the line that will save you. The tough, cold-hardy, reliable lavenders for most of the country are the English types, Lavendula and Gustifolia. The ones with names like Hidcote and Munstead, those will take a real winter down into the cold of Zone 5 in many cases and come back year after year getting fuller and better. The showy ones with the little rabbit ear petals on top are Spanish, lavender, and the big, fragrant, commercial-looking ones are often lavandins or French types, and a lot of those want a mild winter and will not survive hard frost. If you're in a cold winter region and your lavender vanished over one winter and never came back, it very likely wasn't your fault. You bought the wrong species for your climate because the store stocked it and stayed quiet. Why does this matter to the verdict at the curb? Because nothing tanks a front border faster than a gap. A buyer walks a row of lavender and their eye is looking for rhythm, for that repeating silver mound marching along the walk. One dead plant, one bare hole in the line, and the eye snags on it like a chipped tooth in a smile. The rest of the row could be perfect. They see the gap, and when you have to replace one plant out of a row, the new one is smaller and a different shade, and it never quite matches, so the line looks patched instead of planted. Choosing the right hardy variety up front for a few dollars more per plant is what keeps that row unbroken for years, and an unbroken row is what quietly says, stable, cared for, worth the price. Therefore, before you buy another lavender, look up your growing zone, buy an English type if your winters bite, and read the tag for the botanical name, not just the pretty marketing word on the front. That one habit saves you the slow heartbreak of replanting the same gap every spring. But let's say you did everything right so far. Good drainage, careful water, the hardy variety. There's still one mistake that turns a healthy lavender into the ugliest thing on your block, and it's the one I see the most, and it's the one that made that couple stay in their car. Come look at the base of an older lavender. The woody part down low, Reach in and part the stems near the center of the plant. What do you find in there? On most neglected lavender, you find a gray, dry, bare tangle of woody sticks, hollowed out in the middle like a broken bird's nest, with all the green pushed out to the very tips. That is a plant that was never pruned, and it is telling every person who walks by that this yard runs on autopilot. Here's the biology that traps people. Lavender is technically a small woody shrub, not a soft perennial, and it has a brutal rule. It will not reliably grow new green from old bare wood. So every year you skip pruning, the green zone marches a little further out to the tips, and the woody dead zone in the center gets a little bigger until one day the whole plant splits open in the middle and flops apart into an ugly gray ring with a hole in the center. Once it's fully woody, you often can't fix it. You have to rip it out and start over. People think lavender just gets old and dies. It doesn't die of age, it dies of never being cut. The fix takes 15 minutes a year with a pair of hand shears, and it feels wrong the first time you do it, which is exactly why almost nobody does it. Right after the main bloom fades, you cut the plant back hard into a tight dome, taking off the spent flower stems and a good chunk of the green growth, but stopping just above where green still lives, never slicing down into the bare gray wood. You want it to look like a firm little hedgehog when you're done. Do that every single year, and the plant stays tight, dense, silver, and rounded, and it lives for 10 or 15 years instead of falling apart in 3. The couple in the car didn't see a pruning schedule. They saw a woody, split, gray plant, and their gut translated it instantly into neglect. And neglect is the most expensive word in real estate, because the buyer starts silently adding up the roof, the furnace, and everything else they now assume was also let go. Now, right about here is where some of you are checking out, because you're telling yourself, none of this matters, you're not selling, you're staying put, and the neighbors can mind their own business. Stay with me, because this next part is aimed straight at you, and it might matter to you even more than to the seller. Here is the truth that surprised me when the numbers came across my desk. The verdict at the curb isn't only a buyer's game. Studies pulled together by real estate and appraisal groups and university research going back years out of places like Michigan State have put hard numbers on this, and the range that keeps showing up is that a healthy, well-designed landscape can add somewhere between 5 and 12% to a home's perceived value, and in some studies, the return on smart, mature planting runs well over 100% of what you spent. But value is only the part you can measure. The part you can't measure is what that curb does to you every single day, whether or not you ever sell. Because you are the person who pulls into this driveway every evening after a long day. You are the one whose shoulders either drop half an inch when the house looks cared for, or tighten just a little at the sight of the same tired gray plant you keep meaning to deal with. A tight, fragrant, silver lavender border you can smell when you carry the groceries in is a small daily gift to yourself that happens to also be an investment. And the beautiful thing about everything on this walk is that the fixes that impress a stranger are the exact same fixes that make the place feel better to live in. There's no separate expensive version for sellers. The gravel, the shears, the right variety, the restraint with the hose, little money, no contractor, and it pays you in either currency you like, in resale dollars, or in the way you feel turning in at dusk. So the person staying and the person selling are standing in the exact same spot, needing the exact same fix. Which brings us to the last stop, and the one detail I promised you at the start, the one that decides the whole verdict. Walk back to the front of the plant with me and look down at the ground right where the lavender meets the dirt. Look at what's touching the base of the stems. On most yards, one of two things is happening down there, and both of them are quietly killing your lavender and cheapening your whole front bed, and almost no landscaper will stop you from doing it, because the product that hurts your lavender is a product they sell you by the yard. I'm talking about mulch. Specifically, the dark shredded bark or wood mulch that everybody dumps on every bed in the neighborhood because it looks tidy and finished for about a month. On a lavender, that soft organic mulch is a slow motion disaster. It sits against the crown of the plant, the tender place where the stems meet the roots, and it holds moisture there like a wet blanket all day, every day. Remember everything we said about drainage and root rot. This is that same killer, only now you've packed it right up against the most vulnerable inch of the entire plant. The bark also breaks down into exactly the rich, spongy, water-holding soil that lavender hates, feeding the plant nutrients it doesn't want, and holding the damp it can't survive. You thought you were protecting it, you tucked it into a wet bed. Here is the secret I learned the hard way, the one that flips the whole verdict, and I only really understood it after standing in a commercial lavender field and looking down at the ground the growers actually use. They don't mulch with bark. They mulch with light-colored gravel or coarse sand, a clean inch or two of pale stone laid right up to the base of every plant, and that gravel does three things at once, and this is the part that quietly decides everything. First, it keeps the crown bone dry, because water runs straight through stone and never sits against the stem, so the plant almost never rots. Second, the pale stone reflects sunlight and heat back up into the plant, and that warm, dry, bright microclimate is exactly the Mediterranean hillside the lavender was built for, so it grows tighter, more silver, and more fragrant. And third, and this is the one that moves the money, that band of clean, pale gravel around a firm silver mound is the single most expensive-looking thing you can do to a lavender for under $20. Think about why, when a buyer or an appraiser or your sharpest neighbor sweeps their eyes across your front walk, they are not consciously grading your mulch, but the eye has been trained by every high-end garden, every magazine, every luxury hotel entrance to read a crisp band of pale gravel against silver foliage as intentional, designed, and cared for. Bark mulch says, I did the minimum the whole street does. Pale gravel against tight lavender, says a designer touched this. It's the same plant. It's the same walk. The only thing that changed is the 1 inch of material touching the ground, and that 1 inch is what the verdict hangs on. The signal was always sitting right there at the base of the plant. The trade never pointed it out to you, partly because gravel is a one-time purchase. They can't resell you every spring the way they resell bark. And I walked past it myself for years, dumping bark on my own lavender, like everyone else, wondering why it kept rotting and looking cheap, until a grower crouched down, pointed at the wet bark against my plant's crown, and just shook his head. So here is your whole weekend, and it barely costs anything. Pull the bark mulch back away from the base of every lavender you own, expose that crown to air, and lay down a clean inch or two of pale gravel or coarse grit right up to the stems and out a foot or so around each plant. While you're down there, mound the soil a touch so the crown sits high. That's it. No contractor, no permit, one afternoon, and you have just changed the single detail that decides whether your lavender reads as a dead shrub or a designer border, and you've probably added years to the life of every plant at the same time. Because that's the thing I most want you to take from this walk. Everything a stranger judges your home by is sitting out here in plain sight in the inch of ground you stopped looking at years ago. Your lavender was never really about flowers. It was about whether the person who lives here still sees the place or stopped seeing it a long time ago. And now you can't unsee it, which means from today you get to be the one who reads the curb instead of the one the curb reads. You strike me as the kind of homeowner who would rather hear the blunt verdict than be flattered into leaving money and pride out on the front walk. So let me ask you something specific, and I really do want you to answer it. Go stand at your own curb tonight, look back at that lavender, and tell me which stop got you: the wet, rich soil, the sprinkler you forgot was hitting it, the mystery variety from the store, the woody, split-open center, or that band of bark mulch choking the crown. Put it in the comments, just the one that stung the most, and tell me where you're watching from, because I read these and I like knowing whose curb I'm standing on. If you'd rather walk your property with a set of eyes that sees it the way a buyer does, instead of the way you've gotten used to seeing it, come along, because the next walk I'm taking is straight down the driveway itself to the one crack most people fill the wrong way, and it's costing them more than the whole lavender bed ever could. Remember that deep spot at the base of the plant I promised you? Inside my membership, the Curb Appeal Circle, I pick up right where we stopped and walk you through the full front bed lavender plan, soil to crown. Ask me your own question there, and a real person answers, me or my team. Never a machine. You'd be joining thousands of homeowners right beside you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click. Now that you know what to avoid, let me show you how to keep your lavender strong and blooming for years to come. Those simple secrets are waiting for you right here, starting in just a moment.